Hello, welcome. This mini lesson is about text structure, focusing on how authors create different plot structures by manipulating time. And really, this is all about um, appreciating how writers choose to build their stories. And by recognizing that, we can see how um, telling a story in a particular way can make it more interesting and can build suspense or interest or make you like wonder what's going to happen next more, or make you make interesting connections. And recognizing these moves in stories that other writers make can help us craft our own stories in more interesting ways. So there are a few basic types of plot structure, and they all have to do with how the author is manipulating time in their stories. The first is the most common, linear or chronological stories or structure that has a clear beginning, middle, end, and it progresses straight through time in a clear way without jumping around at all. Occasionally, there might be a little bit of a flashback or something like that, but overall, if time is just marching forward in the story from beginning to end, then you got a linear or chronological story. Another kind of story is a parallel story where there are two or more related stories that are happening at the same time. This is becoming popular with stories that will alternate between different characters who have their own perspectives on like the same situation. Nonlinear or fractured structure, as it sounds fractured, it's kind of like chopped up, and you get the story happening at different points, like flashbacks, flash forwards. There's not a clear direction of first, then, next, and finally. It jumps around much more. This is one of the most challenging to read, but it can lead to some interesting storytelling. Finally, circular. This is when a story begins kind of like usually it's like at the most exciting point in the story, and then we get a whole long backstory that leads us back up to the ending and kind of loops around like a circle. Just another way of looking at that, linear stories have this beginning, middle, end with an exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. Parallel structures have the two or more stories going on simultaneously, usually interacting in some kind of way. Maybe they like are two students at the same school, and you're hearing from both of their perspectives. Nonlinear or fragmented is just kind of excerpts all over the place. If you are familiar with The House on Mango Street, that is an example of a kind of fragmented narrative where we get just little vignette stories without a sense that there's a overarching story from beginning, middle to end. Circular, here's my diagram of circular structure where it's going along here at the beginning, and then we get this long flashback that winds us, and then we get right back to the end where it picks up, and then we finish there. Here are some specific examples. Most stories, like think about when we read Lord of the Flies, follow this linear structure where we meet Ralph and Piggy and all of them at the beginning of the story, and then it marches on through through all the events up through to the end, just in a straight line. Superhuman is a cool story. I recommended that some of you read this for independent reading. If you haven't read it yet, I recommend you check it out. It follows a circular structure. Do I have it pulled up here? Yeah, here it is. The very beginning of the story, we meet the main character whose name is Cyrita, and she is talking to this superhero named X. And we don't know how she got there. We don't know why she's there. We're just boom, right in the middle of the action. And then if you look, there's like a break in the page on page 2, and then it says 3 days ago. And we start to get some of the backstory filled in over the next few pages. And then boom, we're right back at the where we started here after this break. So that's a little example of a circular structure in that story. Next one, A Private Experience, which we read last week, is mostly linear, but a lot of you noticed the flash forwards that happen where it says later Chico will do this and this and this. So that is an example of a non-linear structure where it's jumping forward in time at different places. Long Way Down is a really interesting example to think about in terms of this. Similarly, it's mostly linear. It's the story of him from right after his brother was shot to the elevator ride down. But obviously, it's more complicated than that. We get a lot of flashbacks from him in a non-linear kind of way where it's jumping around to different memories, all out of order. And then those elevator chapters, in a way, they're circular because it starts with the person coming in the elevator, and we get this long circular story of who they are and what stories they're telling, and then it ends up back with them in the elevator and they get to the next floor. So that's another interesting example structurally. And we're going to be moving on to reading parts of this book, Homegoing. And this is another really fascinating book structurally. It's got a lot of parallel plots going with these two different sides of the family. And within each chapter, she uses circular structure where we like meet the character in their adult life usually, and then it tells the story of how they got there from their childhood. So stay tuned for that. The way to identify plot structure as you're reading is you look at how the time in the story changes. And if you notice if it's moving in a straight line or if it's jumping around, just look for those shifts. And then when you see those shifts, look for patterns. It's not just random. They're following some kind of structure to how they are organizing the time in their story. And so you can ask yourself what structure of these four that I've taught you fits best with that pattern that you're seeing in the story. So those are the plot structures, and be looking for those when you read Homegoing, and be looking for those when you read your independent reading texts this week.